We are going to go ahead and get started. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining our session today titled Nobody's Home, a deep dive on the risks associated with vacant properties. Just a little about AEI Group for those who may not be familiar with us. We are a family of companies founded by and dedicated to housing. We protect, preserve, and promote the sustainability of affordable housing through insurance, research, advocacy, and training. My name is Mary, and I'm with the risk control team here at AEI Group. With me on this session today is Staige Miller. Staige is a senior vice president with AEI Consultants, and she's responsible for providing direction for the development of HUD environmental services for AEI. So we're very excited to have her here with us today. We do have a brief evaluation for this course. You can scan this QR code with your smartphone, or we will also put the link in the chat so you can easily access that from your browser. And then we'll also have this up at the end of the course as well. So our focus for the session today is going to start with discussing the risks of vacant buildings, how we can protect them, and what we need to consider in terms of insurance. Then Staige is going to speak to us on all of the environmental concerns that come with vacant properties, and she has some really great case studies and photos to share with us. Just a reminder to submit any questions you have, and we'll do our best to get to these throughout the session. So it's important to first define what we're talking about when we say vacant property. Sometimes the words vacant and unoccupied are used in place of each other, but in the insurance world, these really mean two different things. So we consider a building to be unoccupied when the normal operations of that building are temporarily suspended. And there's an emphasis on that word temporary. So for example, if there's a fire in a building and the residents need to be moved out during repairs, that building is considered unoccupied. With a vacant building, there's no occupancy, and that's not a temporary thing. It's a long-term no occupancy. So there's no one living there, there's no construction going on, it's just completely offline. So you can go to the next slide. And we have seen an increase in vacant properties over the years in our industry. HUD had put out a study recently, and it showed that vacancy rates across the board for all properties that receive rental assistance has increased 6% over the last 10 years. A lack of funding can play a role in this. From what we're seeing with our insureds, some buildings are old and they're in need of major upgrades. However, they may lack the funds to make those improvements. So due to this, they've kind of deteriorated over the years, and some have fallen into a state of just disrepair that they're no longer suitable for housing. Also, some agencies are going through RAD conversions as an alternative funding method to rehabbing these buildings. So in the meantime, while those applications are being submitted, plans are being finalized, they may sit vacant for some time. And then another thing we're seeing in the affordable housing industry is vacant buildings being donated from cities. And that may seem great, but there's almost always a reason why you'd be given a building for free. They usually need extensive renovation, sometimes even demolition, that those original owners don't want to facilitate or really be involved in at all. So they may choose to donate it, and then they can receive some tax benefits if it's just been sitting empty and not generating any revenue. And the pandemic did seem to speed this trend up a bit, and you saw an increased amount of commercial space, office buildings, sometimes motels, just sit empty and not be profitable. Staige is going to touch on this scenario as well from an environmental perspective, but if you do find yourself in this situation, it's important to fully evaluate the building before accepting it, just to make sure that it fits your needs for your agency, and then also so you have a good grasp on its condition. So you can go to the next slide. And so the risks. So with vacancy comes many risks, one of them being fire, and specifically arson fires. So vacant properties are easier targets and they're more desirable to trespassers. And to make matters worse, the fire likely wouldn't be noticed immediately, which would then allow it more time to spread throughout the entire building since no one's there. Water damage is another risk. Just the impact of extreme weather can wreak havoc on a vacant building. Heavy rains can cause flooding, cold weather can cause burst pipes. And again, this damage can be much more severe when it occurs in a vacant structure, since it may not be known about or attended to for days or even weeks if you're not monitoring that building. And then from there, serious mold problems can also occur. And Staige is also going to speak on mold a little bit more in depth later on. And then vandalism and theft is another big issue. This can be graffiti or other building damage caused by trespassers. And then also theft of copper is a huge concern. Then there's also just general liability concerns with vacant properties. If you aren't maintaining the property on a regular basis, someone can be injured and you may be held liable for it since it is your building. So there's also insurance implications that need to be addressed. Most commercial insurance carriers will have language in their policy that says if a building is vacant for a certain period, coverage for that building drops. It's kind of a standard practice since vacant buildings do present a significant exposure. At HAI Group, this threshold is 120 days. So coverage for a building will drop after it's been vacant for 120 days. So if you have a vacant building or property that's waiting to be demolished, for example, you could be paying for coverage that you don't have after that 120 days if you don't notify us of that situation. If you do need some level of coverage on a vacant building, there are some options. So it's best to always just speak with your account reps and they can go through some of those specifics with you. You can go to the next slide. If you do find yourself with a vacant building in your portfolio, there are some things you can do to lessen the risk. So first and foremost, you'll need to secure the building and that surrounding area as well as you can to prevent trespassing. So all windows and doors should be boarded up. Exterior lighting and security cameras can help to deter trespassers. Just make sure that those are actually working at all times if you do have them. And then also no trespassing signs. You really should be checking on the property on a regular basis. And it's important that you're maintaining the grounds of the property in the building. By keeping everything orderly, you're really sending the message that the site has consistent management presence and you're really on top of things. The worst thing you can do is neglect the site and just let it look like an abandoned building. In terms of fire safety, I mentioned earlier that vacant buildings are at an increased risk of fire, so preventing entry into the building really is key. All combustible storage should be cleared out, keep that area free of any excess vegetation. That's all going to contribute to reducing the fuel load. Also, another thing to keep in mind, your fire protection systems will need to be kept online and functioning unless you have prior approval from your authority having jurisdiction. So you should always be reaching out to them prior to taking any action on that. And then for weather-related concerns, frozen pipes, of course, are a big risk during winter months. So you should be maintaining the heat at 55 degrees or above unless you have your water drained and totally shut off. And then also make sure you're maintaining the roof, clearing any clogged drains, and then checking in on the building after any large storms. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Staige, and she's going to speak on all of the environmental side of this.
Great. Thank you, Mary. Hi, everybody. Hope everybody's having a good day so far. I'm going to talk about some of the environmental concerns that we see with our vacant buildings and or vacant land properties. I kind of have, a lot of them kind of in this chart here, and some of them break into kind of more hazardous materials concerns, and some of them are more kind of building structural concerns. And so on our hazardous materials side, we're looking at things like lead-based paint concerns, asbestos concerns, mold, if you had leaking underground storage tanks, maybe there was an underground tank for the former current, heating system at the property, and, it still remains in the ground. And then contamination can arise from sometimes our vacant or even our vacant land properties, as well as our building properties when, they're not being used, or maybe something's gifted and we're not sure the history of that project. So that's kind of some of the things on the hazardous material side of the spectrum for those concerns. And then the other side, we've got a lot of things that can happen, structurally to the building when they sit vacant for long periods of time. When the HVAC system's not, maybe it's turned off, or, it's not functioning properly and no one's kind of checking on it. Moisture becomes a problem sometimes, because we have a lot of various ways that water can get into the building when they're vacant. And these create a lot of risks and create a lot of damage into the interior of the building as far as mold, and can help, create more damage to some of those asbestos containing, suspect materials or lead-based paint. So that we'll slip to the next slide there. And so some of the things that I think we, can kind of control a little bit more with our, indoor is our indoor air quality for our vacant properties, and kind of trying to keep up with some of the mechanics behind that, because that kind of affects a lot of, some of the mold and some of the other hazardous materials issues that can arise. But a lot of those issues kind of come from kind of our HVAC equipment. Maybe we've got, bad infiltration, we're not changing the filters regularly. We're not getting enough fresh air through those equipment. And, when we have that issue and we're not checking on those systems regularly, then it can, exacerbate some of the other, issues in the indoor environment for us. And then as it relates to water infiltration and potential for mold growth, there's a lot of things that can transpire as a building could sit vacant, especially if it's, I've worked on projects that have sat vacant for 10 plus 20 years. And when we get to them, the roof's, in really bad shape. The facade itself is in bad shape. And so we find, lots of issues with those, from roof leaks, and it just really creates kind of a really, structurally unstable environment inside the buildings. And so, next slide, please. And so there are some ways that we can kind of, do some preventative maintenance, and, it requires personnel to keep an eye on those vacant properties, and just make sure that some of that equipment is, routinely checked and is running. We would want to not leave. I mean, obviously, if you're going to leave a vacant building for decades, that's a different story than maybe something that's going to stay vacant for 6 months to a year while you're maybe waiting for some funding for a conversion or to demo or rehab those buildings. But if it is kind of more on the shorter term, then, the recommendations to keep that HVAC equipment, functioning properly, making sure that you're still, routinely checking it, changing filters. If you notice any issues with it, that it's being repaired. And if there's any kind of things that we can do to kind of change that equipment, while we have, a vacant situation, that can maybe help, rehab activities later, that's always, something to kind of think about. But what we see when we kind of let our HVAC equipment go and kind of, stop operating those, a lot of other kind of indoor issues start to happen at these vacant buildings. And so next slide, please. So one of the things that we find when we do have those vacant properties and we do, maybe turn off some of that HVAC equipment, is we'll see, a lot of mold growth start to occur in those buildings. And so mold's just a type of fungus, and, most molds, form spores, and then those are released into the air, and then they latch onto, a surface. And so in our indoor environments, they're latching onto drywall, and you'll see a lot of mold growing on drywall, and it really damages those building materials and can be a really hard thing, especially if you're trying to rehab those sites, kind of being able to remove that issue once it kind of starts. And, there's a lot of different types of mold, and there's a lot of different health impacts that can be attributed to mold. Every person can have different reactions to different types of mold. So it's hard to pinpoint, what's always a bad mold and or, what maybe is a good mold. But mold tends to, thrive, and its growth is really influenced by, how much moisture is there in the environment. Is there enough of a food source for the mold to grow, adequate light, oxygen, and then a good temperature for them to grow in. And so we find that, with our vacant properties that, we provide a really good, environment for that mold growth to occur, since, especially if we're not checking on those buildings regularly and they're kind of sitting there, we can come back and, find, mold throughout, those apartment units, and it can be, kind of eye-opening. Next slide, please. And so, how do we know when we have maybe a mold issue? And really, if you can see it, then, there is something that we need to address. And mold really thrives on like three things. It's, having a food source, a good, atmosphere to thrive in, and a moisture source. And so food to mold. They really enjoy living on drywall. And so there's an abundance of food sources within, a vacant building. And there's a good atmosphere for them. No one's no one's bothering them. Maybe the HVAC equipment's off, and there's moisture coming into the building from leaks or facade issues. And so it really kind of thrives on those circumstances. And so the one area that we kind of can control is obviously, the moisture and being able to keep that intrusion from occurring into our structures. Obviously, we can't do much about, the building materials, at the building. Those are needed, and we can't do much about, the chance that the mold will grow, because there's good atmospheric conditions, as far as temperature and humidity in typical building environments. So really what, we would want to do with our vacant properties is just kind of, really try and make sure that we're preventing, all opportunities for, moisture intrusion into those indoor environments. So again, the moisture control is kind of our key to, kind of keeping our mold growth kind of down. And so we would want someone to, regularly check in on those buildings and access, various units and look on the roof and check the equipment, making sure, it's running. Plumbing leaks can happen at any time. And if we're not, accessing areas regularly, then they can create quite a mess for cleanup. And so that's something to kind of think about. We, want to keep our HVAC equipment again, on and working. I've been to a lot of properties where even it was kind of one interesting circumstance was, and this wasn't a fully vacant building, but just to give you an idea of how mold can really grow, is the first floor was office space, and no one was occupying that particular floor, so they closed, they shut down all of the HVAC to that floor, and then the floors above were operating as normal. And then the thought was, oh, well, let's come in and now rehab this vacant floor space. And, come to find out, there's, just a ton of mold just because it was in a really humid environment. And it just, created tons and tons of problem where they had to start removing, contaminated materials, and, they weren't able to have people in those areas anymore. So again, just kind of keeping an eye on kind of conditions and making sure that equipment's working properly. We don't have broken and inoperable windows that are left open, the roof's in good condition, and really making time to repair those issues. Especially, for those times when you're, wanting to do a rehab of your vacant properties. The more we take care of some of those building elements, the less those costs are going to be to get that building back into an occupied position for you. Next slide, please. And so now I've got just kind of a lot of pictures for you of some of what we're seeing in our vacant properties. And then, to wrap up that, we've got a couple case studies to share with you all as well. But in these photos, what we're kind of seeing is there was a plumbing leak. The sewer, the vertical plumbing sewer stack, was leaking. And so there was literally like, sewage kind of, behind these walls. And so that's kind of the photo on the left was, a very poor, workmanship, repair job. But ultimately, we had to, remove a lot of drywall, repair, replace that plumbing stack. And so that kind of went for a long time before it was identified. And at the end of the day, just kind of got fixed enough. And then on the right side, we've got, typical, something that you would see in apartments that are used, right? Is just, the toilet above you is leaking. And next thing you know, your ceilings, starting to show signs of that. And so, those things go unnoticed even in occupied circumstances a lot of times. So in a vacant, situation, it's important to kind of, do regular checks of those areas and make sure that there aren't any leaks. Here we had some facade issues that kind of created a really, lots of moisture. And so in the left picture, there was leaking roofs, there were, bricks that needed repointed, and a lot of moisture just getting into the inside. The downspouts had kind of since fallen off the building and, weren't really keeping the water, from just running down things. And so on the left picture, you've got a lot of deterioration to the actual wall itself. And then on the right, you're seeing a lot of rotten wood and deterioration around the window components. And again, that's attributed to just, roof leaks and poor gutters and just the water infiltrating through that building facade.
Staige, I had a quick question about the previous photo, and this might be an obvious question, but even if it's vacant and the toilets are being used, you could still see this type of leakage from a toilet stack?
Sure. So you could still have some leakage from it, but if people aren't really, going in, I mean, more of when no one's, flushing toilets and using them, it's more like the pipes burst, and then you have those big water leaks from that.
Right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And then here, what we're looking at is, just some poor, that's our, ventilation system. And you can kind of see it's just, kind of sitting there, and we've got some leaking above it. And so there could be pipes above the ceiling that are kind of creating some of those issues, and condensation occurring. And then kind of, in the other photo, we just got kind of a bathroom area, and sometimes the plumbing lines behind the fixtures will start to leak and drip slowly, and can create a lot of damage behind those bathroom fixtures, and also kind of help with facilitating some mold growth too, if they go kind of unchecked as well. Here, a property that's just been kind of, no one's kind of really maintaining it. Nobody's home, right? And so we have, a lot of poor drainage from lack of downspouts on the buildings anymore. And so it's creating kind of these sidewalk issues and ponding water. And so whenever we have a lot of ponding water adjacent to our foundation, then we can, sometimes experience structural foundation issues that, if you've got an older, building, the bricks can start to, settle a little bit because of all the water surrounding the foundation. And sometimes those, repairs can be really, really costly if you have to get kind of a structural, engineer out to look at the facade, and then they provide lots of recommendations sometimes. It can be, super expensive to either, get that building back into an occupied state. And then here we have, these are some basement photos that I've got for the next couple ones. And again, I would say that basements aren't always even, accessed regularly when we have occupied spaces. And then not to mention, when we have vacant properties, then that's probably the last place someone wants to go. When, especially if the power's been turned off and, you're walking around in a basement with a flashlight, trying to navigate. That's always fun. But on the left, there's a lot of mechanical equipment and piping that goes in the basements to service the upper floors. And over time, the concrete and the rebar and the ceiling just started to collapse, due to, the mechanical penetrations that were made into the basement. And so, we've got a pretty, big concern in the basement at this point, because, that's, how are we going to, repair that area? Because we've kind of let it go for such a long time that now we have, lots of, concrete just coming from the ceilings and falling. And then on the other photo, on the right side, we just have some infiltration into the basement. We have some boarded up windows, and it's just kind of water's getting in through those areas and ponding. So just doesn't help the foundation or the structural integrity. Here, more basement, but we've got some loose wires in the basement, become electrical hazard. As Mary mentioned, fires can, can uptick in those vacant properties, not only from maybe people in the building that are, not supposed to be there, or just, faulty electrical, issues that aren't being caught and corrected. And then on the right side, we had kind of another, plumbing leak, and we've just got, kind of, backups in the basement. And again, if those kind of go undetected, you end up with quite a lot to kind of clean up and think about for rehabbing some of these spaces.
Staige, I had another quick question. When you're working with a client and you're looking at a building And I know it depends on the building type, but is there any area of a building where you see more issues than others? Like, is the basement really like typically a problem area, the roof, or like units where you, like you showed earlier with like,
Yeah, I mean, I'd say the basements and the roofs are the kind of like the, places to start really. Basements can flood, pretty often. And so if you aren't checking on them and you had a really big rainstorm and, there's a couple, couple inches of standing water in your basement, that would be, something to maybe check, after storms. Same for roofs after storms and just, seeing how the condition of those. Some of the other, unit issues can kind of, they're hard to probably identify with, on a vacant project. Because some of those have to do with like the roof issues. So those upper floor units. And then, if we're missing downspouts and things like that, it's just, the water's just kind of running down that facade and it's just looking for the, the weakest points for entry. But yeah, I think looking at, basements and roofs is a good, starting point, especially, after, storm events or where, there could be damage that has occurred, from high winds or something like that, from weather related impacts.
thank you.
Here we had kind of some fire damage, a fire damaged unit, and this, unit was obviously, it was vacant, and the impacts, from a fire damaged unit can kind of spread. And if you flip to the next slide, you can kind of see, in the picture on the left, whenever the fire department, is putting out a fire, they're using a lot of water. And so it really creates a lot of water damage in those units, and it trickles down to through all of them. And so a lot of times, whole wings of buildings or, whole buildings themselves can be really impacted by that fire damage. And so part of, is just having good enough security measures to keep anybody out of the buildings is part of, the strategy to kind of prevent those fires from occurring, but those can be really devastating. And as Mary mentioned, if no one's around, then, those fires can spread, quickly and become more difficult to kind of put out. Here we've got some mold issues that we're seeing. We had some roof leaks. And, again, whenever we have roof leaks, we can expect, water infiltration into those upper floors and, creating ceiling collapse and damaged materials and, mold growth. This was also roof related, no one was kind of walking around, and, the condition of these units was significantly impacted. I mean, some of these places, have been sitting vacant for a little bit, but this particular project, it was not a overall, had been sitting for a long time, but, the roof leaks were really, the roof that had been, was on the building was, done in very low quality, and, had lots of roof leaks and wasn't maintained, and, no one was checking, and, the roof, was just leaking down into those units and creating a lot of rotten floors and damage to the drywall, and things were collapsing, and, we've got kind of plaster and drywall falling, and so again, that was just from, bad conditions from some roof collapses.
Staige, we had an attendee mention pollution related risks. Do you ever see pollution related like pollution impacting vacant buildings? And Joel, I know you asked that question. If you want to chime in and kind of clarify what exactly you meant by pollution, I don't know if that meant like environmental remediation issues or actually just like air pollution impacting a building over time.
Thanks for the question. Yes, I was thinking more about the latter, potentially illegal dumping on or around a property. Staige mentioned earlier the issue of buried tanks that may have held fuel or other toxic materials that you either are aware of or not, and can't really assess the condition and may deteriorate even more quickly when the overall property isn't being maintained.
Right. So, I mean, as far as like pollution and, underground tanks, yes, we have those and they're still kind of in the ground and not being, checked, again, we also do tank tightness testing and things to maintain our tanks when they're operable. And so when the tanks sit in the ground for long periods of time, they tend to, have more of an opportunity to leak and create underground concerns. And like you mentioned, Joel, we can't visually see those. So that's not something that's usually kind of pops to our attention first. Usually, our visual observations is what kind of really guides us as to what we think our biggest issues are. But there are a lot of times when, those tanks can, be leaking underground for a long period of time and have created substantial soil and groundwater conditions that could actually require remediation by the state. And then, that requires consultants and lots of fees for sampling and, probably maybe situations that take longer to wrap up for sampling and coordinating with the state for closure and things like that. So it can kind of add to, if we're trying to rehab, a vacant building, it can really add time that's not really thought about to the equation. And that puts everybody behind schedule, and nobody really likes that. And the cost too.
Staige, you mentioned that it's hard to, you can't visually inspect them. You mentioned the tank tightness testing. Is there a way that you could bring in a consultant or somebody to, if you have a vacant building, to periodically run tests to ensure that there is no leak, just proactively? Is that something that you guys do, or other consultants like you would be able to do?
Sure. So yes, environmental consultants, can help. But usually when you have an underground tank, you would want to test it on a yearly and on an annual basis to make sure that it is not leaking. And if you are doing those yearly checks, then, you can catch them, periodically. And then that way you won't, come to a situation where you've had an underground tank since 1970 and it's still on the ground. Because they do have a useful life. A lot of those older tanks are steel construction. They're not the nice fiberglass, super fancy new gas station tanks. So our, apartment type projects and commercial buildings, they're usually serviced by older, steel tanks that don't have a lot of fluff around the tanks to keep them from leaking. And so, yes, you can, and it's relatively inexpensive. You could probably get someone to do that tank test for you on a yearly basis for, less than $1,000. And it could be done quickly, and it really does give you that kind of a little bit more peace of mind if you have that tank kind of, hanging out there. And I guess as far as trying to identify concerns like that, we usually recommend doing, having a consultant out there to do phase ones. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, kind of what we do as part of a phase one. A lot of times vacant buildings, we'll go through asbestos sampling and lead-based paint testing, to find out what those hazards are. So that way, when you are, ready, or the building is to be rehabbed, that those materials can be caustic, because, there are costs associated with those remediation activities. So, and, those older properties, it could be a lot of abatement to even do a demolition. So even if you're not rehabbing it, but you're like, oh, I'm just going to demolish the building, if there's asbestos and lead over there, it'll just come down with the building. Well, that's not really how that, kind of aspect works either. You have to, even with those vacant buildings that you want to demolish, you have to get an asbestos abatement contractor in there. They have to remove the materials prior to the demo, because they don't want those materials to become airborne and become a health risk to occupants or exterior workers and such. So that is something that we see as well, is just those lead and asbestos abatement costs kind of getting into our vacant projects. And as buildings age, the building materials really deteriorate. And so that makes kind of the abatement more costly too. If you have materials that kind of look like these photos and we have to kind of clean them up, it's more challenging because we already have deteriorated building materials that we have to abate now.
Thanks, Staige. And just passing along a follow-up comment from Joel. And I know, Mary, you touched on this earlier about security, but he mentions that when vacant sites units are used by trespassers, aside from arson, which we talked about, there's issues with drug abuse and use, and needles, paraphernalia, methamphetamine production, et cetera. So other reasons why you should definitely worry about security.
Definitely. I think even if you want to switch to the next slide, I might be a couple slides down still, but here, again, we've got kind of deteriorated building, materials where we had, significant leaks and, just no one's wanting to spend the time to fix them, and the building's just going and going and going. And, here we've got, rotten wooden floors, the ceiling sheathing showing, it's quite the project at this point. And then, kind of on the right, we've got, kind of, moisture showing in the ceilings here and some mold growth up here. And so that's kind of another concern that, we are going to try and, demolish these buildings, how are we going to safely do those things? And how are we, if we're going to rehab them, what's the best, way to go about doing that with these types of conditions? And I think so the photo on the right, I think speaks to, kind of what you're seeing, Joel, is, yes, if we have unoccupied buildings, then people will sometimes get into those and set up residence. And, this building didn't have any, it didn't have any, heat, it didn't have any water. So, someone's living there. So I like a lot of things can come from that. A lot of concerns there. And kind of on the right, this project, I think there was a, the heat had been turned off and, no one was there. So the heat was turned off and the water pipes burst. And then that was part of why, there's so much, kind of moisture. You can see the moisture on the floors. And it creates all that buckling and floor rot. And no one, if you're not going into the building periodically, then you're not going to know that your water pipe, that your pipes are burst and, that you have those expansive water leaks there. Here we had kind of an issue where, during kind of the period while the building was occupied, there were roof hatches. So on the left, these are concrete exterior landings for stairs. And you can kind of see that the concrete's getting significantly damaged and it's kind of starting to fall apart and creating pretty big safety hazard for those exterior landings. And this was created, we had roof hatches above this. And, the roof hatches allowed, personnel to get onto the roof, to access the roof. And, rather than keep the hatch was removed because it was easier just to pop up on the roof without having to open the hatch every time. And so what that ended up creating was obviously a big hole there above it. And so all the water would just pour right on through it and kind of, sit on those concrete landings. And it really just took its toll, and it would get into the metal underneath the landings and kind of create all that deterioration. So, now we've kind of created an unsafe, building condition on the exterior, just because over time, now it's just kind of gotten worse. Pest infestations are something to kind of think about when you have vacant properties, and just kind of, just another one of those things that can happen, whether the buildings are occupied or not. But, when we're vacant, you could come into a unit and, it's not really what you're expecting to see. But, there's always, lots of things, kind of left behind too, when we go from an occupied to like a vacant situation. That's where, where we're really starting to see all those units and kind of see what's happening in the building itself. And then if these kind of situations are left unattended for long periods of time, then they just create rapid deterioration, and make it really hard to kind of, either pivot to maybe, a rehab option versus a demo option. And, trying to make sure we're providing, safe and sanitary housing is, part of providing a good, affordable, housing platform.
Staige, before we move on to the case study, another question on mold. Often when you have like water issues, moisture issues, you get like the brown discoloration. If somebody, housing official, maintenance person's, just doing a quick inspection of a vacant unit, how can they definitively, do you have any tips for telling the difference between like just some discoloration versus like you have a mold issue and, without having to pull out like a microscope or something like that?
Sure. Yeah, we do run into a lot of times, where we'll go to properties and, there might be some brown staining. So the key is to really determine if it's like an active leak or not. One easy kind of way to potentially do that is to have like a moisture meter with you, and you can kind of, check for, moisture levels in those building materials. And if you're seeing, elevated levels, then, you probably have something more active, and it's not like really a past leak. Because you can have past leaks and they shouldn't be, as long as they're dry at that point, they're not going to show any elevated levels on those moisture readings. So that would be one way to do it.
Thank you.
Mhm. All right. And so, for the last couple, slides that we have put together, I have a couple of case studies, varying different types of projects. But this particular one, we were working on a project, and it was vacant, it was unoccupied. It had been unoccupied for a really long period of time. And had really, deteriorated over that period of time. So, 15 years. And I will say that there was, a lot of that time, I, wasn't just sitting there and no one was trying to do anything with it. It was just, waiting on different funding sources. Then maybe things changed and different funding sources were sought. And so there was just a lot of trying to figure out, kind of the best use. But the project was originally built in the 50s. And about 1970s, there was kind of a bridge expansion project in the area. And it really bisected the project and kind of, really kind of impacted, the residents and how the property was used. And so the ones that are listed with the numbers 3 and 4, those properties have already been, rehabbed or rebuilt and, are occupied. And then, the project to the, I guess, the east of, the number 3 spot is kind of the project that we were looking at, that was hoping to get some funding for first to demo. So the plan was to do, so it's a vacant, unoccupied building that was going to be demolished. And after the demolition, the plan was to do, new construction with, affordable housing type vouchers and such. So again, really, old property in disrepair. And if you want to switch to the next slide. And so, the proposed, use, again, what we were the plan was to demolish those buildings and then rebuild, kind of a new towers to that area with, additional multifamily apartments and have commercial use on that first floor. And, since that project was on a thoroughfare, you come across the bridge and, it was, kind of a blighted area in the neighborhood. It was surrounded by occupied uses and historic district areas. And so I think there was a lot of, pressure to move on it, but yeah, it takes a while to kind of, figure out the best plan for some of these projects, and they get done in phases, and the phases along, the water were kind of done first. And, this is kind of the final piece of it, of the redevelopment. And then as part of kind of that, study, there were, lots of issues that arose. There was, a former underground storage tank. It was removed. It had been removed, but there was some leaks into the subsurface. And so there was some soil contamination. And, a lot of soil is removed during those removals, but when you have structures involved, you can only remove so much dirt without maybe impacting, those structural integrity. And so all of the contaminated soils weren't able to be removed. So now, whenever you have like a redevelopment activity, you'll have to consider, how will that, contamination be handled for the future development, and, kind of what risk does that pose. But you can kind of see in the figure on the right, the tank was kind of where that blue square is within the red. And that was the location of that former underground tank that serviced those buildings. There were some other environmental concerns identified as well. There was a lot of asbestos containing materials. There was a lot of lead-based paint, mold growth. We had some, we were looking at some federal funding sources. There were some elevated exterior noise levels. We were adjacent to an historic district where there were a lot of historic buildings, so we had to comply with the state's historic preservation office to make sure that our, demolition, we weren't demolishing maybe a significant resource, and if we were, what were we going to do with our new construction to hopefully not impact kind of the neighborhood. But as far as like the asbestos containing materials, there were, a lot of time was spent doing asbestos surveys, and at the end of the day, the building had a lot of asbestos materials, and the more disrepair that occurs, the more that your abatement can sometimes cost, because once, say it's pipe insulation and it's falling off the pipes, now you also have to clean the debris up too. So it's not just removing the insulation from the pipes themselves. Now we have to do kind of a cleanup of, the area surrounding those pipes. And the same for lead-based paint. Once the lead-based paint starts really flaking off the walls, now we've got paint chips everywhere, and we really need to think about how we're going to clean those up and dispose of them. We have to comply with, RCRA guidelines, have OSHA trained workers, and do asbestos abatement kind of up front. So here is just some of the pictures of, again, this building in particular was left vacant for a long period of time, original construction in the 50s, and then had been vacant for about 15 to 18 years, while it was still kind of sorting through kind of how to get the area redeveloped. So we've got graffiti, we've got, in here we've got, substantial areas. You can see a lot of peeling paint. I mean, this was just the first floor. It wasn't safe to really get much higher up into the building. So, you're really limited too with, structural integrity and being able to get around in some of these locations, but lots of peeling paint, definitely a hazard. And we'll, it'll be a lot to do for abatement to get those buildings demolished. Just, kind of what a typical interior unit looks like. We've got just people coming in, maybe taking some of the pipes, vandalism occurring, during the time it was vacant. I'm sure lots of people have lived in and out of the buildings over the years. Maybe not anymore. I think now it might be a little too too much disrepair to be occupied even temporarily. But lots of vandalism was occurring at the site over the years. Excuse me. And here, this is a great pictures of kind of this is what the pipe insulation looks like. The whole floor below is covered with pipe insulation debris, and pipe insulation is like a friable asbestos containing material, meaning that you can crush that material in your hands and produce make it into like a powder. And whenever you can have friable asbestos, then that means it's easier to breathe in and cause health impacts to the occupants and such, and workers. So when you have conditions like this, you should be accessing things with respirators and trying to take appropriate safety precautions. But lots of really bad condition asbestos and lots of peeling lead paint at this particular project. These were just the boilers. The basement ended up having like a couple inches of water in it. So there's, kind of standing water in the basement. You've got asbestos boilers. You've got, mold even starting to grow on those boilers, and just not very good conducive. So obviously, this project, is planned for more of a demo side of things rather than a rehab. And then I think the last, picture we've got, this is just the elevator lobby. And, I think Joel, you had mentioned, the potential for people to come in and just drop off stuff. Well, maybe in the middle of the night, someone came by and was like, well, let me just dump some of my trash here. And, so rather than, I think a lot of times those vacant land properties, people like to go and, dump trash at. Maybe, these buildings can serve those same kind of, situations for surrounding developed communities, and so it's always hard to tell kind of what you might find when you get into these vacant buildings. Any questions on kind of that particular case study that anyone had, or it's still in progress, all right. And so here, we had a project where, the housing authority was kind of gifted, a property. And as far as this one, it was kind of vacant, used, recently vacated office space. And, it was at this point, as far as everybody knew, it was being used as an office. No, nothing really super concerning. But it was built, in 1912. So, there's usually a lot of history that goes with these kind of things when they were, constructed at that point in time. So some of the environmental concerns that we identified were the historic uses of the site. There was a lot of like industrial uses, auto repairs, machine shops. And so, at the end of the day, a phase 2 was needed. And, you're always, everybody hopes for good results from a phase 2, but, there's those times when you find contamination and you're like, now I got to clean this up too. And how much is that going to cost? And how quick can the state help me? And so there's a lot of those, questions and concerns that can arise. And just to give you guys kind of an idea, to go back real quick, the kind of the picture on the right is one of the historical sources that, your consultants that do phase 1s, are looking at to figure out the history. So if you're ever like, how do we, come up with what the property was in 1895 or 1915? We look at these Sanborn fire insurance maps, and we're really trying to, see what's shown. They show gas tanks, they show, storage areas, manufacturing plants. They show us where tanks are located for gas stations, auto repair shops. So they provide a lot of really good, valuable information that we can use. So that's something that we see with our, historical research as part of that phase 1. This one, had limited, kind of asbestos concerns and lead-based paint concerns, not, nothing like what we saw in the last case study. So a lot less to kind of think about there. And then, this one also had some historical issues that we kind of had to think about, and, if you, depending on the type of funding that you're looking for, ultimately, you could have noise concerns. It was next to an interstate. So I think Mary mentioned, whenever we have those gifted properties, something, there's probably a reason. And, it's always good to maybe, think about it early on. And then kind of the last one that I kind of wanted to share was, this is a vacant land site. Again, the city, ended up getting some good brownfields grants and got some grants, but it was an industrial rubber manufacturer for about 100 years. And it looks like a nice little grass field right now. But if we go to the next slide, you'll see kind of that's what it was, for 100 years, really heavy, industrial site. And so now, cleanup, we've gotten some of our brownfields work done because we got some grants, but how are we going to now redevelop that site? The city's, it's kind of, ready to kind of have someone redevelop it at that point. And, multifamily apartments is always a good option, right? And so, it's got a new proposed use, and, some of the issues with that, proposed use were, there's a railroad track right next door to it. So, we have noise levels and horns blowing, and we have remediation to finish still. We still have work to do. Just because we had a couple of grants to do a couple of assessments, no one actually, planned for us to build multifamily apartments. Even if you find out, oh, well, they've got a closure letter, always be skeptical. Make sure that closure letter is planning what you want to do with this site. Maybe that closure letter is for, maybe it limits the use of residential land use altogether. And you're like, oh, well, how do I get it to be residential use? There's another historic district involved. And so if you're doing federal funding, that could, pose issues for you. Making sure that you get the project rezoned for the appropriate use. And even after all of that, there's still there was an operating, industrial facility to the north of our site. So maybe, we always have to kind of think about, what kind of implications, when we have these projects that are sometimes gifted to us, or maybe, the city's like, oh, we've already cleaned this site up. It is ready to go for you. Make sure to do the homework. first. And so I guess, one of the things to just recommend, if you'll hit the next slide, so that we can try and avoid some of those complications is to get that phase 1 ESA done, and have someone, your consultant go out and do that historical research. We find a lot in the historical research. That's one of the biggest areas we find recognized environmental conditions that we have to remediate. So there's a lot to the history and all of the regulatory listings nearby. So definitely recommend whenever something seems too good to be true, to have someone, a consultant or someone that you're comfortable with do those phase 1s, because they'll uncover kind of what's happening and be able to provide you a lot of good advice on how to maybe redevelop or rehab those projects and move forward from a vacant state. That's all I really had. I don't know if there was other questions or anything that came up on the chat that I can help with.
Thanks, Staige. We had one other comment from Joel just mentioning the dumping issue and that they've had a lot of those issues in the Seattle area. So just confirming that. But no other questions right now.
Okay, great. Great.
Go ahead and head on over. Yep, thank you. So I'm not seeing anything else. We will be following up. We'll send out the recording to this session along with some other materials. We usually send out this survey link as well. I just want to thank you, Staige, so much. This was really great to have your perspective on this, to cover some of those environmental issues. So I hope everyone found this helpful. We just got a comment that this was very informative. So again, thank you. If anyone has any other questions, please feel free to reach out to us. If not, I hope everyone has a great day.
All right. Thanks for having me. Take care, everybody.